The wind screamed across the open desert, dragging ribbons of dust and sorrow through the air. What had once been a trail of wagons, a hopeful line of settlers bound west, was now nothing more than shattered wood and silence. The buzzards circled high, already claiming what the Apache raiders or the merciless sun had left behind. Among the wreckage, a young woman stirred. Clara Whitmore blinked against the blinding light, her lips split and dry, her bonnet gone. The smell of smoke still clung to her dress, mingling with blood and dust. Her body ached with bruises, her mind fogged with disbelief. Only hours ago, or was it days, she'd been laughing beside her father's wagon, talking about the land they would claim near the Salt River. Now, she was alone. The first thing she heard was the groan of wood settling in the heat. The second was the terrible stillness, no voices, no horses, no breath but her own. Her heart pounded in her chest, the sound deafening in the emptiness. She turned slowly, seeing the trail behind her littered with broken wheels, a doll's head, a man's boot. Her father was nowhere to be found. "Papa," she whispered. But her voice was too weak, too brittle to carry. The word vanished into the vastness. She tried to stand, her knees trembling. The sun pressed down like an anvil, stealing her strength with every step. She stumbled over a fallen barrel. The last remnants of their food split open, grain mixing with sand. She crouched beside it, scooping a handful of dry kernels into her mouth. They scraped her tongue but gave no comfort. There was no direction anymore. The road had been swallowed by dunes, the horizon endless and cruel. She wrapped her torn shawl tighter around her shoulders and began walking. The sand burned her bare feet and her skirt snagged on thorns. Once she thought she saw smoke in the distance, maybe a town, maybe a camp. But when she blinked, it was gone. Mirage. By the second day, her mind began to drift between memory and madness. She saw her mother's face, long gone to fever, smiling as she brushed Clara's hair. She remembered the church bells in St. Louis, the smell of lilac soap, the laughter of girls her age. Now all that seemed like another life, belonging to another woman. The desert showed no mercy. Each night the cold cut through her thin dress. Each day the sun stripped more of her will. Her lips cracked until they bled. Her eyes burned from the glare. Still she walked because stopping meant dying. On the third night she found a dying mesquite tree and collapsed beneath it. Her body was too heavy to lift, her throat too dry to swallow. Coyotes howled somewhere nearby, their cries echoing like ghosts. She tried to pray, but the words tangled in her throat. "Please, don't let it hurt," she whispered to the darkness, unsure if she spoke to God or the wind. Her vision blurred, stars above her spinning, merging into one long river of light. She thought she saw a figure move between them, tall and silent, watching her from afar. A man? A spirit? She couldn't tell. She closed her eyes, surrendering to the stillness, to the pull of sleep that promised release. The desert quieted, holding its breath. Then came the sound of hooves. Slow, steady, deliberate. The figure she had seen was no spirit. A shadow moved toward her, leading a painted horse. The man walked with a hunter's grace, his dark hair bound with leather, his chest bare beneath the moonlight. A bow hung across his shoulder, and his eyes, sharp and wary, studied her like one might study a wounded animal. He crouched beside her, silent, his shadow falling over her face. She was too far gone to be afraid. Her hand twitched weakly in the sand. The last thing she felt was the brush of cool water against her lips and the low murmur of a language she did not understand. Then, darkness claimed her, and when she woke, she would no longer be alone. The desert was quiet when Taza, son of the Chiricahua hunter, knelt beside the white woman's body. Her skin was blistered, her lips cracked and bleeding. The scent of smoke and death clung to her, telling him she had come from the place the soldiers burned 2 nights ago. He had watched from the cliffs then, had seen the wagons ambushed and the survivors cut down, but he had not interfered. That was not his war. Yet now, looking at her, something twisted inside him. She was breathing, barely but alive. He pressed a hand to her shoulder and felt the weak rise and fall of her chest. "She is cursed," he muttered in Apache, glancing toward his horse. The animal flicked its ears uneasy. The elders always said white women carried misfortune, that they brought soldiers, sickness, and sorrow wherever they went. He should have walked away, but when her head turned slightly and her cracked voice whispered something faint, some word he did not understand, his resolve faltered. She was so small, so breakable. The desert would finish her within the hour. He looked around. The sun was climbing fast, the air already thick with heat. There would be no shade for miles. With a low sigh of resignation, Taza lifted her into his arms. She weighed less than a sack of grain, her dress stiff with dirt and dried blood. He slung her across his horse, mounted behind her, and began the long ride toward his hidden camp near the canyons. By midday, sweat poured down his temples, but he didn't stop. The woman's head rested limply against his chest, and several times he thought she had stopped breathing. When they finally reached the shade of the red cliffs, he carried her to the cool mouth of a cave where a spring bubbled faintly beneath the rocks. He soaked a cloth in water and pressed it to her lips. At first she didn't move. Then slowly she drank. Her throat worked weakly and her eyes fluttered open. For an instant their gazes met, hers blue and wide, filled with confusion and terror, his dark and cautious like a wolf watching fire for the first time. When she tried to speak, only a rasp came out. Taza lifted a finger to his lips. "Sss," he murmured softly, a sound of calm. He dipped his hand again into the water and offered it to her. She hesitated, staring at his bronzed hand and the faint scars that ran across his knuckles, before finally drinking. He could see the questions forming in her eyes. Who are you? Where am I? What will you do to me? But none of them could be answered, not with words. He didn't speak her tongue. And even if he did, what could he tell her? That he had saved her only because his heart had betrayed his reason? When the sun dipped low, Taza built a small fire and roasted a rabbit he'd trapped that morning. The woman tried to sit, but her strength failed. He tore the meat into small pieces, placed them near her hands, and waited until she gathered the courage to eat. He noticed how she avoided his eyes, how her trembling hands betrayed both fear and gratitude. It stirred something unexpected in him, protectiveness. As night fell, coyotes howled across the desert. The firelight danced on the walls of the cave, painting their faces in gold and shadow. Taza leaned back against the rock, his bow within reach, and studied her from the corner of his eye. She had curled into herself, clutching her shawl, the flames reflecting in her tear-wet eyes. He didn't know what he would do with her come morning. Returning her to her people was impossible. Soldiers roamed the roads, and his tribe would call him a fool for helping the enemy. Yet leaving her alone again would mean her death. He rubbed his jaw, thinking. There was something the wind whispered about her, something that told him her presence was not chance. Finally, he closed his eyes and spoke a quiet vow to the spirits. If she lives through the night, it is because the desert wills it. Then she will belong to me to protect. Outside the wind shifted, and for a heartbeat, it sounded like a woman's sigh, and deep in the cave, the lost girl slept. Alive because an Apache hunter had broken his silence and chosen mercy. When Clara awoke, she didn't know where she was. The faint scent of smoke lingered in the air, and somewhere close she heard the steady trickle of water. Her first instinct was fear. Her pulse quickened, her eyes darting from shadow to shadow. The last thing she remembered was the desert swallowing her, her lips whispering a prayer she hadn't finished. Now she was lying on a blanket of animal hide, wrapped in a rough woven cloth that smelled of cedar and earth. Light streamed through the mouth of the cave. Beyond it stretched the wild land, towering red cliffs, a ribbon of sky and silence. Then she saw him, the man from her dream, or perhaps her nightmare. He was crouched by the fire, sharpening a blade. The movement was rhythmic, precise, and somehow graceful. His long black hair was bound at his neck, and his skin glowed bronze in the sunlight. His chest bore faint scars that spoke of battles survived, and the expression on his face was unreadable. When their eyes met, her breath caught in her throat. He didn't move toward her, nor did he speak. He only nodded once, as if acknowledging that she still lived. Then he returned to his task. "Where am I?" she whispered, but he gave no answer. She tried again, voice trembling. "Please, who are you?" He looked up, meeting her gaze, and tapped his chest. "Taza." She frowned, repeating the word uncertainly. "Taza." He nodded once, then pointed toward her. "Clara," she said softly. Something flickered in his eyes. Recognition, perhaps not of her name, but of her humanity. He repeated it, his accent rolling over the syllables. "Clara." She almost smiled. though fear still twisted inside her. For the next few hours, they existed in silence. Taza offered her a bowl of water and a strip of roasted rabbit. When she hesitated, unsure if she should trust him, he tore a piece himself, ate it, then gestured for her to do the same. She ate slowly, the taste of salt and smoke reviving her strength. He watched her, not with the cruelty she expected, but with the cautious patience of a man observing a creature from another world. She could feel his eyes studying her pale skin, her trembling fingers the cross that hung at her throat. When she caught him staring, he turned away quickly, hiding his expression behind the rhythm of his work. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the sound of a hawk's cry. After a while, Clara tried to stand, but the effort sent pain shooting through her legs. Taza was beside her instantly, steadying her by the arm. She flinched, expecting harshness, but his touch was firm and careful, not cruel. He guided her back down, shaking his head slightly. "Rest," he said. The word was accented but clear. Her heart stumbled at the sound of it. He knew more English than she thought. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. The firelight flickered against the cave walls, and outside, the desert hummed with unseen life. She watched Taza sitting at the cave's edge, bow across his knees, eyes scanning the horizon. He looked as though he belonged to the land, untamed, alert, carved by hardship. And she was an intruder, a stranger from another world. She remembered her father's stories, how the Apaches were said to be savage, bloodthirsty, impossible to reason with. Yet the man who had saved her did not fit those tales. He hadn't harmed her. He had fed her, sheltered her. She thought of the way he had carried her, how gently he had placed her down, how his voice had murmured soft words she hadn't understood. When the wind grew colder, Taza rose and added more wood to the fire. The glow illuminated his face, and for a brief moment, he looked directly at her. Neither spoke, but something unspoken passed between them, a flicker of understanding, fragile and dangerous. He pointed to the food beside her, then to his own mouth, as if teaching a child. "Eat," he said. "Eat," she echoed, the word trembling on her tongue. He nodded, faintly pleased. For the first time in days, Clara felt the faintest spark of hope. She didn't know what this place was or what would come next, but she was alive. And though she couldn't yet name it, she sensed that her fate had become bound to his, that her world and his, so different, had begun to weave together in the quiet language of survival. In the heart of the desert, under a sky full of indifferent stars, two strangers began to learn the shape of each other's silence. By the fourth morning, Clara had regained enough strength to walk beside the stream that wound past the mouth of the cave. The water was cold and clear, and the desert air carried the scent of sage and dust. She moved slowly, leaning on a stick Taza had carved for her. Every now and then, she looked over her shoulder, half expecting him to vanish, half hoping he wouldn't. Taza followed at a distance, bow in hand, his gaze sharp as he watched the ridges and sky. He was a man used to silence and danger, and Clara had begun to sense that every gesture he made, every glance, every pause, was born from years of surviving in a land that offered no mercy. They had begun to understand each other, if only through fragments, simple words, gestures, and looks. She could ask for water by miming a cup, and he had taught her the Apache word for sun, ta'a, laughing softly when she mispronounced it. But that morning, the world around them changed. While Taza cleaned a kill by the river, Clara wandered a little farther, following the flight of a hawk. She didn't realize she had stepped beyond the cover of the rocks until she heard the thundering of hooves. A band of riders appeared from behind the ridge, 5 men painted for war, their faces streaked with red and black. They were Apache, but not of Taza's band. Clara froze. The men reined in their horses sharply, shouting in a language she couldn't understand. One of them dismounted, walking toward her with predatory ease. His eyes gleamed with curiosity and something darker. Before she could move, Taza's voice rang out from across the clearing. He strode toward them, bow in hand, his presence commanding. The warriors halted, recognizing him. Their leader barked a question. sharp, mocking. Taza answered in a low, fierce tone, his words quick as flint strikes. Clara didn't understand, but she could feel the tension, like a storm gathering between them. The other man laughed, gesturing toward her. He said something that made his companions grin. One spat into the sand. Taza's expression darkened. In a sudden, startling motion, he stepped in front of Clara, his arm reaching back as if to shield her. His voice cut through the air, sharp as a blade. Do shita, shi yaji. The words carried weight and fire. The other men fell silent. Clara's pulse thundered as she watched them exchange glances. Whatever Taza had said had changed something, turned hostility into wary respect. The leader frowned but gave a curt nod. Then, one by one, the warriors turned their horses and rode off, dust rising behind them until they vanished into the desert. Only when the silence returned did Clara realize she was shaking. She looked up at Taza, breathless. What did you say?" He turned to her slowly. For a moment he said nothing, only studied her face, her wide eyes, her trembling hands. Then, with deliberate care, he pressed a hand against his chest and repeated softly, "Wife." She blinked, not understanding at first. He touched her wrist then, his fingers strong but not cruel, and drew a dark line across her skin using ash from the fire. His eyes met hers as he whispered again, "My wife." Her heart lurched. She tried to speak, but no words came. She didn't know the meaning of Apache customs, only that whatever he had done had carried power. The way the other men had looked at him afterward, the way they'd left without a fight, it all told her this was no small gesture. He had claimed her. Her mind reeled. A part of her wanted to protest, to tell him she hadn't agreed. But another part of her, deeper and quieter, remembered the way he had stepped between her and danger. The way he had spoken for her, when she could not speak for herself. Taza met her gaze again, his voice rough but steady. "Safe now," he said in halting English. "No man take you." The simplicity of it, the fierce certainty, sent a strange warmth through her. She looked down at the faint black mark on her wrist, at the symbol that meant protection, or possession. She wasn't sure which. As the sun dipped behind the cliffs painting the desert gold, Clara sat beside him by the fire, silent. The air between them was charged with something fragile and new, an unspoken bond neither of them fully understood, but both had already begun to honor. In that harsh, endless land, he had named her wife not with ceremony or blessing, but with the only thing the desert respected, claim and courage. Days passed and the rhythm of survival drew them together in quiet, steady ways. The desert still ruled them, its hunger, its silence, its fierce beauty. But the space between Taza and Clara began to fill with something softer. Each dawn, Taza rose before the sun, leaving her sleeping form by the dying fire as he went to hunt. Clara would awaken to the scent of sage and smoke, the distant cry of eagles and the faint echo of his footsteps returning at midday, with rabbit or quail slung over his shoulder. At first she stayed near the cave, wary and uncertain, but gradually she began to help, gathering wood, fetching water, learning to crush roots for medicine. It was survival. Yes, but it was also becoming something like life. The first time Taza tried to teach her a word, it happened by accident. Clara had been grinding corn in a small stone bowl he had traded from a nearby band. Her hair, sun-bleached and tangled, fell into her face as she worked. When she finished, Taza pointed to the bowl and said, "Taji," she frowned. "Tazi," he chuckled, actually chuckled and shook his head. "Taji," he repeated slower, the sound deep and patient. She mimicked him again, her accent twisting the syllables. This time he nodded. Good. The sound of his approval, quiet though it was, warmed her more than the fire ever could. From then on, they began to exchange words, one language for another. She taught him fire, water, and sky. He taught her ko-tu and ya'ati. They laughed at their mistakes, their voices blending into the hush of the desert evenings. When she burned her fingers while turning meat over the fire, he caught her hand before she could pull away, scolding softly in Apache. His thumb brushed over her skin as he whispered something low, words that sounded like comfort. She didn't understand them, but she didn't need to. The tenderness in his voice said enough. At night, after the desert cooled, they sat by the fire. Clara would trace shapes in the sand, sometimes drawing the cross her mother once wore, sometimes a line of wagons rolling west. When he asked with a curious tilt of his head, she tried to explain her father, her journey, the attack. Taza's eyes grew dark when she mimed the sound of gunfire and pointed toward herself, toward the horizon. He understood. When she was finished, silence stretched between them. He stirred the fire with a stick, the flames painting gold across his face. "My people," he began slowly, his English halting. "White soldiers kill my mother, my brothers," her breath caught. He pointed to the scars across his ribs. "War," he said simply. "Many winters." Clara's eyes filled, not with fear this time, but with something deeper, recognition. They were both orphans of violence, shaped by the same merciless hands. For a long time, they didn't speak. The fire cracked softly, and the desert wind whispered through the rocks. Finally, she said, "We're both ghosts." He didn't know the word, but he heard the sorrow in it. He reached out, touching her hair, a tentative gesture as if testing whether she was real. "No ghost," he said quietly. "You live." The simplicity of his words broke something open in her chest. She looked up at him, and the air between them shifted. His gaze lingered, not demanding, not claiming, but seeing her fully for the first time. The next morning, she caught him smiling at something she said, a rare, fleeting thing that changed his whole face. It was then she realized how much she had begun to need that smile, that quiet assurance in his eyes. In the wildness of the desert, language was slowly becoming a bridge, a fragile thread that bound their hearts more tightly than either intended. And though neither spoke the other's tongue fully, both were learning the same truth, that in the emptiness of the world, two broken souls can find meaning simply by learning how to say each other's names. The peace they had built, thin and precious as spider silk, could not last. By the time the spring rains came, word had spread across the desert that Taza, son of the Chiricahua hunter, was harboring a white woman. Traders whispered it around campfires. Scouts carried it through canyons, and before long, the story reached the ears of his own people. One afternoon, Clara was washing her shawl in the stream when she noticed Taza standing motionless on the ridge above, his shoulders tense, his bow in hand. The sight of him that still made her heart stir now filled her with dread. Something was wrong. A moment later, she saw them. 5 Apache riders approached, their horses kicking up plumes of dust. They bore the marks of Taza's own band, painted faces, feathered spears, and the hard, suspicious eyes of men who came not as friends but as judges. Clara's breath caught. Taza walked down to meet them, his body taut with readiness. They greeted him in their tongue, their voices sharp, clipped. Clara couldn't understand their words, but she didn't need to. The anger in their tone said enough. The leader, a broad-shouldered man with a hawk feather in his hair, pointed toward the cave where Clara's small pile of belongings rested. Then he turned to Taza and spoke again, slower this time, as if giving him a chance to yield. Taza shook his head once. The man's jaw tightened. He dismounted, stalking closer. The exchange grew heated, words cutting like blades. Clara watched helplessly, her heart pounding. When the man gestured toward her again, his expression filled with contempt, she flinched. Taza's hand moved to his knife. The tension broke like thunder. Both men shouted, short, guttural words, and for a heartbeat Clara feared blood would spill. But the hawk-feathered man only spat in the dirt, his voice a low snarl. Then, after one last bitter glare, he turned and mounted his horse. The riders wheeled away, vanishing into the heat shimmer. When silence fell again, Taza stood alone, breathing hard. Clara took a hesitant step forward. "What did they want?" she asked softly. He looked at her, his eyes dark and stormy. "They say you bring death," he said in slow English. "They say soldiers come when white women stay." Her stomach dropped. And you? What did you say to them?" He hesitated. Then he met her gaze with quiet defiance. "I say, they touch you, they die." The words struck her like lightning, terrifying and tender all at once. She wanted to tell him to stop, to let her go before his loyalty cost him everything. But when she opened her mouth, No words came. His face was unreadable, his jaw set like stone. But beneath the steel she saw the truth. Fear. Not for himself, but for her. That night, the fire burned low and the air between them pulsed with tension. Taza sat sharpening his knife, the steady scrape echoing through the cave. "You should have let them take me," Clara whispered at last. He froze. Slowly he raised his eyes to hers. "No," he said simply. "Desert gave you. You are mine to protect," she swallowed hard. "And what if protecting me gets you killed?" He paused for a long moment, then she saw something flicker across his face. A memory, maybe of the family he had lost, of every battle that had taken more than it gave. Finally, he said, "Then I die with honor." The words silenced her. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain. She watched him rise and stand at the cave's mouth, staring into the dark horizon where thunder rolled. She knew deep down that the men who had come would not be the last. The world beyond the cliffs was closing in, soldiers, outlaws, tribes divided by loyalty and vengeance. And somewhere inside her, a terrifying realization took root. She could not bear to lose him. The storm that brewed beyond the desert sky was nothing compared to the one beginning inside her heart. By dawn, Taza had gathered their things. He did not say where they would go, only that they must leave before the next moon. As they rode out together, the first drops of rain fell across the desert, each one a promise, each one a warning. The air was thick with the scent of rain and smoke. For days, Taza and Clara had ridden north through the canyons, avoiding trails, sleeping under ledges and drinking from rain-filled hollows. Clara's body ached, her dress torn and stiff with dust, but she didn't complain. She had learned silence from him, the kind that kept you alive. When they finally stopped, they built a small shelter of branches in a hollow between two cliffs. Taza hunted during the day while she gathered what little she could find: roots, herbs, cactus fruit. He was quieter than before, always watching the horizon, his hand never far from his bow. Clara felt the tension in him like a drawn bowstring. Something was coming. She could feel it too. That night, while Taza skinned a rabbit near the fire, Clara knelt beside him, her fingers brushing the edge of his hand. "You're worried," she said softly. He didn't answer. His eyes flicked toward the canyon mouth, then back to her. "Cavalry," he murmured, his English low and halting. "Tracks 3. Maybe 4 men close," her heart lurched. "Soldiers?" He nodded once. "They hunt. For me," she whispered. "For both." The words chilled her more than the night wind ever could. By midnight, the rain began to fall again, steady and cold. The fire hissed under its touch. Taza motioned for her to gather their few things, and together they fled deeper into the canyon, the ground slippery beneath their feet. Thunder rolled overhead, echoing like war drums. When the first rifle shot cracked through the night, Clara froze. Taza whirled, eyes sharp, and grabbed her hand. "Run!" They sprinted through the darkness, water streaming down their faces, the flashes of lightning revealing ghostly cliffs around them. The gunfire came again, closer this time. Clara stumbled, her boot catching on a rock. Taza turned, lifted her without slowing, and carried her through the narrow pass. Behind them, voices shouted, English angry and clear, "There." By the rocks, bullets struck the walls, showering sparks of stone. Taza ducked behind a boulder, setting Clara down roughly. He returned fire with his bow, each arrow cutting through the rain with silent precision. 2 soldiers fell, their cries swallowed by thunder, but there were more. Clara's hands shook as she pressed herself against the rock. "Taza, please, we have to go." He didn't move. His eyes burned with the same fierce light she had seen the day he claimed her. "Go," he said firmly. "You hide." She shook her head. "Not without you." Another gunshot ripped through the night and Taza grunted, stumbling. Clara gasped as she saw the dark bloom spreading across his shoulder. He caught himself against the rock, breathing hard. "Taza!" She crawled to him, pulling at his arm. "You're hurt." He winced but shook his head. "No time." When she refused to leave, he grabbed her hand, gentle even in his pain, and pressed it to his chest. "Clara," he said, voice raw. "You stay alive, promise." She blinked through tears. "Not without you." Their eyes met, hers wide with terror, his steady even as the world around them burned. Then in one swift motion he lifted her chin and kissed her. It was fierce, desperate, and full of everything words couldn't carry: fear, love, defiance, and the promise of something bigger than either of them. When he pulled away, she could still feel the warmth of him, even as he turned back toward the gunfire. She didn't listen to his command. Crawling through the shadows, she reached for his quiver, loading one of his arrows with trembling fingers. As another soldier appeared, she loosed it wildly. It struck the man's chest, sending him backward into the rain. Taza turned in shock, then pride softened his expression even through the pain. "Good," he rasped, almost smiling. The rest of the night blurred into chaos: fire, lightning, and the cries of men who should never have come. When the storm finally broke and silence returned, Taza lay beside the dying fire, pale but breathing. Clara pressed her hands to his wound, whispering every prayer she knew, her tears mingling with rain and blood. He opened his eyes once, his lips forming her name. "Clara," he whispered. "You..." Strong, and for the first time she realized he wasn't just fighting to protect her, he was fighting for her, because in this vast, brutal land, she had become the only thing that made him believe life was still worth holding on to. That night, beneath the burning sky, the desert took blood but gave love back in return. The storm had passed by dawn, leaving the canyon drenched and still. Smoke curled from the remains of their fire, the air thick with the scent of wet earth and gunpowder. Clara sat beside Taza, his head resting in her lap, her hands sticky with his blood. She had torn her petticoat into strips to bind his shoulder, whispering prayers she hadn't spoken since childhood. He hadn't moved for hours. "Taza," she whispered again, brushing the hair from his forehead. Please open your eyes." The only reply was the slow rise and fall of his chest. Relief washed through her, fragile as morning mist. He was alive, but barely. She looked around the canyon. 2 soldiers lay still in the mud, their faces pale and strange in the weak light. The others had fled. She didn't feel triumph, only sorrow. Death was everywhere in this land, and yet there was also him. For 2 days, Clara tended his wound. She boiled water in his iron pot, cleaned the gash, and forced him to drink a bitter tea she made from herbs she'd seen him use before. When fever came, she stayed beside him through the night, pressing cool cloths to his skin and whispering his name again and again, as if her voice alone could hold him to the world. Sometimes he spoke in delirium, snatches of Apache words, a woman's name, the sound of a child's laughter. She didn't understand, but she could feel the ache behind them. Once he stirred and reached for her hand. "Nakai," he murmured. "Woman." "I'm here," she said softly. "You're safe." He fell silent again, but his fingers stayed tangled in hers. By the 4th day, his fever broke. When he woke fully, his eyes were clearer, though his strength had drained away. Clara was crouched beside him, grinding herbs with the back of a spoon, her hair wild and tangled, her cheeks smudged with dirt. She looked like a spirit of the desert, fierce, determined, and utterly human. He watched her for a long time before speaking. "You stayed," she looked up sharply. "Of course I did." His gaze softened. "You could run." "You did not." She frowned, not understanding how to answer that. "You saved me, Taza, twice now. What kind of woman would I be if I didn't do the same for you?" A ghost of a smile tugged at his lips. "Strong woman." "Stubborn woman," she corrected, but there was warmth behind her words. That evening, as the sun sank low and painted the cliffs in gold, Clara helped him to the edge of the stream. He leaned against her for balance, his skin hot under her arm. She washed the blood and dirt from his chest with careful hands, tracing the scars that mapped his life. "Who gave you these?" she asked quietly. He stared at the horizon. "Many men. Some white, some not." His voice was calm, almost detached. "Each one tried to take something from me." "And did they?" He looked at her then, eyes like embered coals. "Not yet." Her breath caught. For a long moment, neither spoke. The wind rustled through the dry grass, carrying the scent of rain and smoke. Finally, Clara said, "You're different when you speak English." "How?" "You sound..." She hesitated, then smiled faintly. "Gentle." He huffed a low laugh, shaking his head. "No one calls me gentle." "I do." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, something fragile, deep, and wordless. She reached up, brushing her fingers against his cheek. He didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his face slightly, letting her hand rest there as though he needed that touch to remember he was still alive. That night, They shared a small meal, dried meat, cactus fruit, and silence. The firelight flickered across his skin, casting shadows on the canyon walls. Clara leaned against the rock beside him, exhaustion finally taking her. Before sleep claimed her, she felt his arm shift. Slowly, carefully, he wrapped it around her shoulders. She didn't resist. For the first time since the night she was taken, she felt safe, not because she was hidden, but because she wasn't alone anymore. When the wind whispered through the canyon, she heard his soft voice beside her. "You are my wife now," he murmured, as if naming a truth that had already been written in the stars. And though she knew the world beyond that canyon would never understand, Clara didn't protest, because somewhere between blood and fire, fear and tenderness, his claim had become her choice. By the time Taza could walk again, autumn had come to the desert. The nights grew colder, the days shorter. Clara had learned to move through the land as he did, silent, watchful, attuned to every rustle of the wind. Her skin had tanned beneath the relentless sun. Her once delicate hands now bore calluses from work and survival. Yet something else had changed too, something in her heart. She was no longer the trembling woman who had been lost and alone when he found her. She was stronger now, steadier. And every time Taza looked at her, she saw both pride and sorrow flicker in his eyes, as though he knew what she was becoming, and what she would have to leave behind. They traveled north, following a dry riverbed that wound between red cliffs. One afternoon they came across a patch of wild corn growing near an abandoned camp. Clara's heart leapt. "People lived here," she said softly, crouching beside the withered stalks. Taza nodded. "My people. Long ago," she turned to him. "Do they still live nearby?" He hesitated before answering. "Some far to the east, others gone." His tone was heavy with loss. Clara felt it in her bones, the ache of a world fading away. As they made camp that night, she sat beside him in the glow of the fire. "Taza, when this is over, when the soldiers stop looking for me, what will you do?" He stared into the flames. "Return to my people. I am a hunter, a son of the mountain. I cannot live in the white man's towns." "And what about me?" she asked softly. He didn't look at her. "You do not belong to the desert." His words were quiet, but they struck like a blade. She turned away, blinking against the sting in her eyes. "I thought you said I was your wife." He was silent for a long time. Then he said, "You are, in my heart. But the world will not let it be." Days passed under the weight of that truth. They spoke less, though their silences were filled with things neither could say. Sometimes she caught him watching her, when she braided her hair, when she laughed at the sight of a curious lizard, when she sang softly in English while cooking. His gaze carried both longing and resignation. One evening, while gathering firewood, Clara saw dust rising in the distance. Her heart seized. Men on horseback, 5 of them, riding hard through the desert. She ran back to camp, breathless. "Taza, riders!" He was already on his feet, bow in hand. He climbed the ridge and peered across the plain. "Soldiers," he muttered. Clara's blood went cold. "They found us." He turned to her, eyes fierce. "We go now." They rode into the night, but the sound of pursuit followed them, the pounding of hooves echoing through the canyons. Clara clung to him, her heart hammering. At dawn, they reached the edge of the Apache territory, wide open plains where the world seemed to end. Taza reined in the horse, breathing hard. "They will not follow here," he said. "Why not?" He looked toward the distant mountains. "They fear my people's land." She followed his gaze and saw smoke curling from a distant ridge. Her pulse quickened. "Your tribe?" He nodded slowly. "Yes, my father's camp." A mixture of relief and dread filled her. "Then we're safe." But Taza's face remained grave. "Safe, maybe, but not welcome." That night they approached the camp under cover of darkness. Fires flickered in the valley below, the scent of roasting corn and smoke heavy in the air. Voices carried through the stillness, men, women, children. Clara's throat tightened. These were Taza's people, the life he had left behind for her. As they reached the outer ring of tents, warriors appeared, bows drawn. They recognized Taza immediately, their expressions shifting from shock to suspicion. One of them, a tall man with sharp eyes, stepped forward and spoke rapidly in Apache. Taza replied, his tone calm but firm. Clara couldn't understand the words, but she could feel the tension pulsing like a live wire between them. Then the man's gaze turned to her. His eyes narrowed. He said something cold, and the warriors murmured in agreement. Taza moved between them and her, his hand on his knife. "No," he said, his voice low but steady. "She stays." The man spat into the dirt. Clara's heart thudded. She understood even without words. They didn't want her here. And as the firelight flickered across Taza's face, she saw the truth settle in his eyes. To save her, he might have to choose between the woman he loved and the people who made him who he was. For the first time, Clara realized the fight ahead was not against soldiers or storms. The Apache camp stirred before dawn, the sound of drums and distant chanting rising with the first light. Smoke from the fires curled upward, carrying the scent of cedar and corn. Clara stood just beyond the circle of tents, wrapped in a blanket, her breath misting in the cool air. The stares of the tribe burned against her back, some curious, others cold. Taza had been taken to his father's lodge before sunrise. The elder, Chief Ahote, was said to be wise and merciless both. He would decide their fate. Clara waited, her heart heavy. She wanted to believe Taza would return soon, that his people would see what she saw in him: honor, strength, love. But the silence from the lodge stretched long and painful. When he finally emerged, the dawn light caught the streaks of red paint across his chest, a mark of both respect and warning. His face was unreadable as he crossed the clearing toward her. "Taza," she whispered, stepping forward. "What did he say?" He stopped in front of her, his eyes shadowed. "He says you must go." The word struck her like a physical blow. "Go. White men will come soon," he said quietly. "They will burn this camp if they find you here. My father says your presence brings danger." She swallowed hard. "And what do you say?" He didn't answer right away. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for hers. "I say you are my heart." His voice cracked, rough with emotion. "But I cannot let my heart destroy my people." Tears blurred her vision. "Then you'll let me go?" Taza's jaw tightened. He looked at her as though memorizing her face. The lines, the freckles, the way her eyes trembled but didn't break. "I will take you to the edge of their land. From there, you go north. You will find settlers, a mission." She shook her head fiercely. "No, I won't leave you again." He cupped her face, his touch gentle but firm. "Clara," he said softly, using her name as if it were a prayer. "You must live." They rode together one last time, through canyons still golden from sunrise. Neither spoke. The world seemed to hold its breath around them. When they finally reached the high ridge where the desert spread endless before them, Taza stopped his horse. "This is where I leave you," he said quietly. Clara slid down, her legs unsteady. "And what about you?" "I go back. My people need me." A bitter wind swept through the pass, carrying the faint echo of a hawk's cry. Clara turned to him, tears streaking her dust-covered cheeks. "You saved me, Taza. You taught me how to fight, how to live. I can't just walk away like none of this mattered." He dismounted slowly and stood before her, the rising sun burning gold behind him. "It mattered," he said, "more than anything I have ever known." He reached into the small leather pouch around his neck and withdrew a thin braid of his hair bound with red thread. He tied it gently around her wrist. "So you remember." Her hands shook as she touched the token. "You don't need to give me something to remember you by." He smiled faintly. "Then it will help me remember that you still live." When he turned to leave, she caught his arm. "Taza." He looked back, his eyes dark with all the words they couldn't speak. "I love you," she said simply. He froze, his breath catching. Then he stepped close, pressing his forehead to hers. "And I will love you beyond the last fire, beyond the last hunt, beyond death." The kiss they shared then was not desperate, like before. It was soft, final, and full of peace. When they parted, Taza mounted his horse and rode toward the mountains without looking back. Clara stood until he vanished into the red dust, her heart breaking but whole all the same. Weeks later, Clara found herself among settlers near Santa Fe. They took her in, fed her, asked about her story. She told them little, only that she'd been lost and saved by a man whose name she could not forget. At night, she would look to the east where the desert met the horizon and whisper his name to the wind. And sometimes, When the wind changed, carrying the faint scent of cedar and rain, she swore she heard his voice answer, low and steady like the heartbeat of the wild. "You are my wife still, Clara? No distance can take that away.